Hello, everyone, and welcome to In Limbo Conversations. Today we have with us Dr. Michael A. Peters, a distinguished professor in the Faculty of Education at the Beijing Normal University. He's also an emeritus professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His research interests include a wide variety of fields, and mainly, I think, education, philosophy, social policy. And within philosophy, he tends to focus on the significance of, I think, contemporary philosophers like Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and a lot of work on education as well. And I think his current major projects include work on distributed knowledge, learning and publishing systems, and very interestingly, open education. So do check the links out in the description to know more about Dr. Peters and his work. And so thank you, Michael, for joining us today. It's really nice to have you here.
My pleasure.
So we'd like to talk to you about your work, and it's very interesting, especially nowadays with the pandemic situation, this whole post-truth era, and how this everything mixes up together. It's a big mess, and I think works like yours and people that you collaborate with, all of this work sort of helps us untangle this mess a bit. So we're hoping that we can talk about that and see what insights you can give us a bit. So I'd like to start with this idea of post-truth. You have this very interesting viral theory of post-truth. So before we get into that, could you just tell us, I know it's a bit wide of a question, but could you tell us what you think post-truth is and what exactly it means in today's world, how it functions?
Okay, so the term post-truth was mentioned by the Oxford English Dictionary back in 2017 when they included it as part of the lexicon. And the concept there was really an attempt to show how our understanding of truth has changed dramatically with under the influence, in particular, of social media. So when you talk about truth and you talk about the history of truth regimes and the history of truth in that respect, then you need to pay attention to forms of transmission, to regimes, and also, of course, to the development of media, and the way in which we've shifted from largely a truth system in the public sense that was based on industrial style newspapers to now, to of course, the internet after 1992 and the phenomenal growth of social media and forms of social media. So instead of getting a kind of vertical veracity, I guess, from sources of well-respected journalists, under the old industrial model, which really was, expert journalists who said to themselves that they were pursuing the truth and they had a craft called journalism that they followed. Now we have a kind of set of horizontal messaging, a different kind of form of communication where people share not only ideas, not news any longer per se. The commodity of news has pretty well disappeared. What we have is a bunch of other stuff, photographs, Facebook. Well, we know what goes on Facebook. And these are large aggregation forms of media, owned by the very, very large American and Chinese companies, high-tech companies. Let's say they're oligarchies. They really control the news now. They control the ability to receive the news. So, the old concept of truth, let's say, in the public world, as it related to publishing, really is going by the board. industrial newspapers are closing down, unless they can find a kind of digital solution to the problem. Now we face a much more of a kind of vertical communicative structure than we do a vertical one from expert to public, in shaping public ideas. And that's become very dangerous because, there's no such thing really as truth. There are no ways of maintaining or sustaining or checking the veracity of statements in the same way that you could in the industrial model. And I say from a philosophical viewpoint, this maps back onto my my interest in Friedrich Nietzsche, in particular, to Wittgenstein, and let's say in more philosophical terms, what I would call non-foundational accounts of truth. But also, we would say, in relation to Heidegger, you go back to pre-philosophical conceptions of truth in relation to, the Greek concept of aletheia or aletheia, which means, closest to, in Greek, to our concept of truth. And we find, for instance, in the Odyssey, the word aletheia is used, Heidegger's famous analysis of it in this case, and we have in the Odyssey, the phrase, "Then verily, child, I will tell you the truth." Well, that goes back a long, long way, part of the oral tradition before the institutionalization of philosophy. And we have a concept of truth here, which is more ontological than epistemological. And I think that's correct, although the epistemological may be simultaneously part of the practices of truth going back some way. But certainly there's an ontological view, and it is, the ability to tell the whole truth. In the Homeric version of truth, it is a kind of responsibility to represent the whole story of something that's happened, the whole story. And, our court of law in the West, when you say, "I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth," really, we have a kind of historical anchor here going back, many centuries. So I think we have to tell a story historically about the emergence of truth, different truth regimes. So I'm very influenced by Michel Foucault, particularly when he talks about parrhesia, and truth practices going back to the Greek. But I also, from my point of view, Foucault spent a lot of time talking about truth, the conditions of the practice of truth, of the truth teller, as opposed to, in the analytic tradition, much more kind of preoccupation with truth conditions, with the old Platonic true justified belief, kind of concept. From my point of view, and the Wittgensteinian point of view, really, is I don't think you can talk about truth without talking about lies.
Yeah.
So the two seem to me to be interlocking parallel kinds of language games. And, I think we need...
It doesn't come up without lies on the side. You won't have truth if there weren't any lies, I guess.
Yes. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. When you examine the practices, the everyday practices of truth, and the way in which they change their character, to take one example, the game of confession, which is telling the truth about oneself, that Foucault investigates. Here is something that comes to the fore in the 3rd to 5th centuries as the concept of self practices, self cultivation practices spring into view, and the monastic way of life begins. But I think that we also need very much to look at the history and the practices of lying in public life. And when we do that, what we see is some very disturbing trends, which we can describe under the term post-truth. And many of them, we talk about the politics of post-truth. Many of them refer to the way in which politicians and others that seek to influence forms of government can massage the message, to use McLuhan's kind of term here, for political gain and for political purposes. And I think we see what we're seeing now in the US with Donald Trump is an extreme example of exactly this phenomena. I think it's very dangerous for the world because, it muddies the water so much that it's very difficult for people to do instantaneous fact-checking about what he says. And you see the technique, not just of the big lie, but of the many big lies. So people who have looked at his claims, they find that he has made thousands. He has made thousands of lies from the moment he took office, really. And I wrote a paper around that because it's a significant educational problem, I think. It's a problem for philosophers, for sure, but they're just a small group of people who live on the fringes of society. I'm saying it's central to public life. It's central to an educated public in particular, and to everybody who goes to school. So, we need to recognize the threat to public life that it poses.
So you brought up three really interesting points out there. Two of them which I would like to talk about going forward. One being the idea that big companies do own a lot and do control a lot of the media, and they do sort of manipulate it in messages. So I would like to come to that later, and what you just said as well in the end. But before that, this idea that you have of the viral theory of truth, and like you mentioned, Wittgenstein, Foucault, you follow them in that mold.
Yeah.
Like you also mentioned, they are anti-foundational in a sense. They are more contextual, like you said, going away from the analytic, which tends to be acontextual and sort of, like you said, look for just the truth conditions. But your viral theory of post-truth seems to move along those anti-foundational contextual lines, saying that maybe, the nature of truth changes as we go along, depending on which era we are in and what we are in. So is there, because now we tend to term it post-truth, as if there was this big chunk of truth before. As you really pointed out, it wasn't the case that there was a big unchanging chunk of truth as such. There were many truths. And then now, what is different about this post-truth era that wasn't there before, when regimes of truth, as you say, were changing? What's really separate about that?
Okay, so I think we have to look very carefully at technologies of truth. I mean, I don't think, I'm both a materialist and a historicist. Okay, so that's my broad orientation. And I think we have to look at regimes of truth as they emerge. What we're facing at the moment, since 1992, has been this kind of networked development of social media, which has, come to be recognized in the 2000s as a regime of post-truth.
Yeah.
A post-truth. And, let's say one of the differences, well, of course, with the industrial news networks, you had a sort of top-down model of truth, and it was basically, let me say, it was the still large corporations that ran them, but there was some basic conventions for being able to check facts. And, it was a slower medium. And after that change and that process of digitalization, what we see is a very different kind of news media emerging. As I say, horizontal rather than vertical, as one example, when you talk about sources and authorities and so on. And also, truth doesn't figure much, if at all, in the post-truth regime. It still can be determined according to the historically evolved, traditional means that we use to investigate the truth in a courtroom, or in let's say a detective investigation, or in a classroom. There are methodologies that we learn, we follow, and these are, from a Wittgensteinian point of view, they are social practices that we have evolved to do this. When it comes to social media, we haven't, the concept of truth doesn't really figure greatly here. What does figure, though, is something that really is important from a social and epistemological point of view, and that is the rise of conspiracy and conspiracy thinking. And, I think, it behoves educators and philosophers to begin to look very carefully at this huge rise of conspiracy thinking. And I think, we say really now a kind of, let me say, a huge increase in the number of conspiracies. And we might say also a form of government that has arisen called, government by conspiracy. And again, here, government by conspiracy, there are some very, very interesting examples here. I think that's where I used the term some years before the current coronavirus, came into view. I used the term viral modernity because I think that there are two forces in cultural and biological being, and that is, on the one hand, we would say biology, and in particular new biology. I'm talking about genomic science, and on the other, I'm talking about information science and the way in which these two have come together. And I think they have come together in different ways. They share some features. Everybody knows we can talk about a computer virus, and that functions in relation to, an analogy. But I think that being a historicist and a materialist, I also want to look at the emergence, of a kind of viral modernity, where these two systems shape cultural evolution. They are the most powerful forces going forward: new biology and information science. And we see that. That's why I like to talk, about capitalism in terms of bioinformation. And I wrote a paper for a journal, an Australian journal called Thesis 11, called Bioinformational Capitalism. Yeah. And because I think that the two forces are harnessed, so it's a form of political economy, really. You see them develop biology and information, bioinformational capitalism. And the outstanding example here is Craig Venter, who is the venture capitalist biologist who was the first to map the human genome, and is now the CEO of a company called Longevity Incorporated. Where he's using basic, new biological and genomic science, selling it to the rich, really, to extend their lifespan. So I think, that's my kind of my operational paradigm here really is the bioinformational paradigm. And in the United States, and I think we see it elsewhere, it's a form of capitalism, and it's a capitalism that's coming, that's on the way.
So this is, like you pointed out, bioinformational capitalism. You have this paper, and that, I think by the end you talk about how that can transition into a sort of transhumanism. And in your paper on bioinformational capitalism, you talk about how this might eventually sort of transition into this transhuman idea. That's what they seem to be working towards. Like you also mentioned about the startup that you said, that the company that works for longevity. But there is also another part which kind of connects to what you mentioned before, which is this big media who has the power, who has who controls the media spaces. But they're also almost, there's a big overlap with the companies that also harness your information. Nowadays, you have a lot of information harnessing, sometimes even biological information harnessing. So there is another side of the information in the sense. There is a negative, non-positive side to that as well, which kind of connects to this whole idea of post-truth and how it works. And so maybe to sort of shorten the question or rephrase it, it would be, how do you see this idea of, okay, there is a rich section of the world which owns media, social media, all of this. They also have this information. They also have our information in our hands. And they seem to be playing this post-truth game a lot more than anyone else.
Yeah.
And
well,
so
we have, let's say, in terms of this regime, we have the emergence of global players in a way we haven't seen before. I mean, we talk about the big five, Facebook, Amazon.com, so on, in America. And of course, similarly in China, Tencent, Alibaba, WeChat, and so on. There are these big, very, very big interconnected global systems. Actually, they are two parallel systems that don't meet. Not really, they don't meet. Google is not in China. It may be one day, who knows? But at the moment, the Chinese are very happy developing their own, digital systems. But you're right. The downside here is that democracy is part of that kind of past era to do with industrial media. We haven't figured out what democracy looks like in the new digital era. People are very suspicious of the way in which companies like Facebook can sell, the data, personal data of 87 million people, and they can upset the apple cart when it comes to elections, as they did in the UK at the Brexit election. So, I mean, I think, the seriousness is to see this as an interconnected whole, and also to recognize the huge dangers to the way in which national democracies operate now. We don't seem to have the same interconnectedness as information capital. And these systems can be used to depose, and to elect, various authorities. And I think, this upcoming election is with the US, which everybody is focused on now, is going to be quite an interesting example of this. But we've seen what Twitter politics means. Twitter politics. We know what that means, and really, it is something that progresses through muddying the water, because you can say something. By the time somebody's checked it, it's already gone out to a large number of people, and you don't have time to fact check it in the way that you do with, industrial style media, it's instantaneous, and immediately you move on. And what does it do? It harnesses and works on the prejudices of the people that accept. I'm sure, let me say, that the Christian right would accept pretty well anything that Trump said. And so the concept of truth doesn't really get off the ground here. The concept of evidence, of testing claims, of being able to engage, let me say, in the rationality game, the language game of rationality, or the language game of truth. These practices now have changed so dramatically. When you look at it from a discursive point of view, you've got to say, look, the language game of truth now and the practice that we're engaged in have dramatically changed. And we've got to recognize what those changes are. And I think that's why, while I was trained as a philosopher at Auckland University, and I did my PhD on Wittgenstein, I was also a teacher. And I thought, not just that it was easy to get a job, in education departments, but also it was more important, because you're dealing with some really tricky issues now. So, I think that the concept of conspiracy and conspiracy thinking reminds me of, Gregory Bateson, in particular, Steps Towards an Ecology of Mind. He's I think, great inspiration, particularly when he says there is an ecology of weeds too. And by that he means there is an ecology of error, and error repeats itself in the system. So we don't really know how to deal with that situation. Not yet. We're grappling with it.
Yeah, hopefully. We don't really see it going anywhere, in the present sense, unless there's a radical rethinking, like perhaps you're trying to do, or many other thinkers are trying to do, sort of rethink the whole idea of this, what truth means and how to deal with this. I think, like you brought up, the biggest problem seems to be there's this flooding of information and you're not able to verify any of it. And that seems to be like the biggest problem that there is. It's not even that there are lies or that there are half-truths and all of these different practices. The problem is verification and evidence. I think evidence also forms a big part of a lot of your work. You talk about how it hinges on the problem of evidence. If you had something to say about that, you could, but
I do.
Yeah, sorry.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, look, the traditional Platonic view here is quite useful. Not for its, the true justified belief conditions of knowledge, they don't apply to information. So there's no truth condition, there's no belief condition, there's no justification condition, okay? So it might apply to knowledge, but it doesn't apply to knowledge. But the true justified belief analysis helps us greatly it helps us greatly with trying to distinguish between information and knowledge, because this information is still information. Let me say, other forms of misinformation, deliberate misinformation, is still information. But in neither case, so we've moved from kind of truth regimes really, from industrial media to digital systems. And these digital systems are information systems, and information systems don't really fulfill, or you can't really apply traditional philosophical criteria from the epistemological tradition to them. There's, as I say, there's no belief condition. There's no truth condition, and there's no justification condition. There is just, a kind of cybernetic rationality working there, and it's a global one. And as you also mentioned, the amount of information is, there's some law about it doubling every so many years. The massive amount of information out there is, is huge. So, and also we're moving into data intensive science. So it's actually changing. It's also changing the status of science and education. So I think you can talk about algorithmic science, and you can talk about algorithmic science, and also let's say forms of science that operate on quite different practices from that, that don't involve a knowing subject. They are algorithm-derived forms of data analysis. And that's a very big step forward too, because when you talk about truth, generally speaking, the fallback position is to talk about science as the embodiment of rationality. And now that kind of paradigm's up for scrutiny.
I was going to ask you about education, but you mentioned a point about algorithms, and it reminded me of, since you've also worked there, about China, and how they seem to not just be leading the way in that department with relation to algorithm and harnessing data and information, bioinformation in a sense, and putting that to use in a lot of ways. And you've been there, and I think you've worked there for a long time. To connect that to sort of the biopolitics of a citizen, of living in the world, and their reaction, the different reactions that you have to the pandemic from, say, someone like China, who leverages all of this power and information and algorithmic data that they have, versus the rest of the world, which prides itself on freedom, but cannot really tackle problems the same way that China managed to. I don't know if it's a good thing, bad thing, but there seems to be a difference between how you can approach problems depending on what sort of information you have and what you do with it, especially with the human and the human body and our lived experience. So what was your experience out there in China? What do you think is like different about them? How do they use the information?
Well, I think, let me just say, because we're facing escalating tensions between the US and China, not just trade wars, but technological wars. And these wars emanate from not only a paranoid racist ideology against China, and you can prove that through data analysis of many of the tweets that have been made and so on. But the US, the White House, understands they've been caught napping, and the Chinese have invested billions over the last decade into algorithmic science, deep learning, and so on. All those areas really, which are the digital technologies now that lead science. I prefer to use a term that Jean-François Lyotard uses, technoscience. I think the term technoscience, but Lyotard doesn't invent, actually comes from a Belgian philosopher who first used the term, and I use it as well, because I don't think we're dealing with science per se any longer. We're dealing with something called technoscience that operates differently. It's a different set of practices. I think Chinese understood what the game was and invested, as I say, billions of dollars. They lead in all areas of digital technologies. And I think, even with fully automated systems in relation to factory production, but also social systems, and we can see, when I say two distinct parallel technological systems that the world is currently, made up of, the American one and the Chinese one. And frankly, I really like WeChat. I use it all the time. I prefer it. I prefer it to Facebook. Now, and I think the real source of difficulty here, of tensions between the US and China, is because America really wants to slow China down, and they are really very worried about the dominance that Chinese have in these new areas of technology. Not only information science technology, but also in genomics, and the life sciences. So, and how they deal with it. Well, it's kind of like when you look at COVID-19 and the various responses by democracies on the one hand and communist states on the other, you know, let me say the political scientists must be relishing the comparison, because what we see is that with strong central state, there is a way of enforcing social distancing that citizens understand, and they can bring these pandemics under control quite quickly. And although the Chinese, there were some hiccups in the early release of information, and I don't know, I did not investigated that. It could have been local, provincial Communist Party officials who wanted to cover up this or cover up that, you know. But once it went national, we saw complete control of this phenomenon at a street level. A kind of, in the same way, really, that Foucault actually informs us that the plague was handled many centuries ago. You know, ultimately comes down to if you isolate, then you're isolating the virus, you know, and you're stopping the spread of it. Now, I think what's really kind of interesting is that you have this group of people on the far right who want to demonstrate their freedoms at a time when solidarity is required, when the good of the community as a whole needs to be considered. Now, you know, I'm thinking about the kinds of dilemmas faced by people like Anthony Fauci in the United States when he opposes a president with, you know, like Donald Trump, who likes to personalize everything, you know, how much he can say in a scientific way that actually contradicts his policies. Well, we're seeing, you know, the results of complete mismanagement within the largest and Trump's way, the best democracy in the world. Well, they haven't really handled it very well at all, and now you know, they are suggesting, the scientists, Johns Hopkins University epidemiologists, suggesting that we might see, you know, by January, 415,000 deaths in the United States alone. You know, and also we're seeing it in, you know, the virus is also, you know, really cutting a swathe, you know, in the Yemen, for instance, where there are no social distancing procedures at all. You know, and let's say in some African countries, in Bangladesh, in India, very high, you know, and we're looking at second wave and third wave, and we're looking at the way in which the virus can change. Now it's hitting younger people as well as older people. So, you know, and when you look at, there's an interesting paper that I should mention by Anthony Fauci and one of his colleagues David Moser, I think his name, published last month, that says we have entered the era of pandemics. And the implication of this is with world population approaching 10 billion mark, with overcrowding, with the way in which our exploitation of nature is chopping down all the forests, in the Amazon and elsewhere, with other forms of environmental degradation. We are setting ourselves up for pandemics in the future. And of course, at the moment, we see 3 or 4 of these new viruses every year, these novel coronaviruses operating. In some sense, we're heading to 1 million deaths globally. The Spanish flu was 18. We have been, let's say, the management of the virus has differed according to political system quite dramatically, quite dramatically. And our ability to work together globally has been impugned. It has been broken. Donald Trump and the US have changed their tune and robbed the World Health Organization of funding. And the World Health Organization here is a product itself of a kind of new Cold War. And how does an organization like that Zizek calls, he calls this organization communist? I'm not sure that I would want to say that, and I'm sure that the World Health Organization also would be upset to hear his description. But what do? Well, they utilize the system in terms of a concept of openness to share scientific data as soon as possible. Well, you put together that wonderful bibliography that you sent me of just the philosophers talking about the virus. But when you look at the scientists across a number of related fields, we're talking about tens of thousands of scientific papers, and most of the big publishers who always want to put science behind a paywall are now making it open access. So open access is part of this deal, and it's also part of a new series, a new kind of knowledge ecology that enables people to cross-check. So, openness is one of those fundamental global values that enable us to share knowledge, like really in the using the digital systems, but with some kind of respect for empirical truth. Yeah. And I think that's a major step forward. And I really do stand for. I mean, I've written lots of papers and books around openness as a fundamental kind of value in relation to science, in relation to knowledge economy. I call it knowledge socialism rather than knowledge capitalism, because when you talk about peer review, basically this is the ability of the community. I mean, and even in some long haul sense, Peircean sense, of the community of scientists getting it right in the long term.
Sort of a cumulative thing. But if I was to, hello?
Hello?
Oh, yeah, sorry, the video disappeared a bit, I'm so sorry. But if I was to sort of say, so this kind of moves into this idea that you have about education. And when you talk about openness and about open access, and that's part of your thinking about education. But also, if you were to connect it to this whole post-truth barrage of information, misinformation, disinformation. And so this is my final sort of question, final thing that I would like to talk about, because I think it sort of crystallizes the problem, like you mentioned. It's not just for philosophers or for certain sections of society. The larger implications are wide with the education of our, of humanity as a whole. Education, you have to think about it very differently from how we thought about it before. This whole thing just changed. So just to finally, what are your thoughts on education in this particular situation, the post-truth scenario, and like you said, with openness and all of those things? Is that how we have to move forward, with an open, sort of open access openness?
Yeah, I think, this is a great argument for including philosophy at school level. We need to be able to approach these questions from a philosophical way. We need to teach kids really how to think philosophically, what a claim is, what is evidence, what is the history of evidence, what's the history here of science, and also I've got to say, one of the features of the current regime is that we've seen the huge growth of the far right, of which, white supremacism of Donald Trump is an outstanding example. And alongside that, we've seen the huge increase on social media of hate speech and hate groups. So we need to understand the philosophy of hate here. That's a great thing for schools to look at. The head of the UN recently sent a tweet around concerning the way in which the United Nations was very upset at the growth of hate speech on the media.
Yeah.
And we also, in New Zealand, we're a pretty open society, but we have, our elections coming up very shortly. We have one new party called Advanced New Zealand, which is a really conspiracy party. Mm-hmm. They think the ability to manage the virus is actually a communist plot. And
there's a lot
also
of that around the world. It's not just, I think,
yes,
delegated news.
Absolutely. And and I heard one person who, because epistemologically we need to understand the structure of conspiracy, and kids need to understand this as well. How do you appraise this stuff if it happens on social media? And here's the thing. I came across one flat earther who was a member of this new political party, and she's reported in the press. This is her understanding of flat Earth. She said, "Look, we're spinning at the Earth is spinning at so many 1,000 kilometers an hour. How come we don't spin off? Yeah. How come people just don't spin off?" Well, she had part of the explanation there, that the Earth actually is revolving at a considerable speed, but she really didn't have the concept of gravity to help her understand the absurdity of the claim that she was making. So, not all conspiracies are irrational. When journalists investigated Watergate, they were tracking, a conspiracy. And it turned out to be a real conspiracy, and their exposure of it actually led to, Nixon having to resign. So I don't hold the view that all conspiracies are irrational, and I think that some of them do have rational elements to them. You can have false and true conspiracies, but I think that we have a duty to equip kids who have grown up in the social media world to come to terms, to be able to appraise and come to terms with these claims, these very dangerous claims that really diminish the space for argument, for deliberation, and for assessing the truth of what people are saying.
That was supposed to be my last question, but you mentioned something that really interested me. Made me think, when you give the example of the flat Earth flat earthers or how they think, to say. And you said that, okay, this person didn't seem to have the complete concept of what gravity means and what it implies. If I were to go back to something you said in the beginning, very beginning, about post-truth, and how about how truth is moved from something that was complete, sort of whole truth or complete truth, into something that's a little more fragmented nowadays. Do you think education is then, in a sense, just the job, not just, but mainly the job of filling in these gaps that we seem to have because of our new sort of media consumption, or sort of our new sort of way of digital?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, first of all, what I was saying there
Sorry, Mike,
was
this sort of complete, like, is education sort of, are we just trying to fill the gaps in that? Is that all conspiracy theories, and is that the main problem of the post-truth era? Is that nothing
no,
is
I don't think so.
Are we trying to move back to the idea of, okay, complete truth?
No, I don't think so. I think some of it is deliberate misinformation, you know, and that now we do face a new conjunction of power of politicians with the big, global media systems, and also forms of algorithmic analysis that allow certain claims to be perpetrated that are clearly false, but that people believe them. So, that's a problem for not only for media, but also it has huge implications for democracy, because we can become the pawns of these systems. And I think, when you take the capitalist element into account as well, then you have the use of personal data that is aggregated without you ever having a say in it. And it can predict, ontologically, it can predict your moods, what you're willing to buy. It can plug into, your identity claims and be seriously manipulative. So, all of that, our curriculums, we've introduced media studies recently, but we need also philosophy in schools. And I think we need also, let me say, political economy, because I think those two need to go together. So that's what I would say in relation to education. A critical view of the environment that people find themselves in, and there are good sides to it as well. Which, I mean, the openness and the sharing of information and critical pedagogy can be based on those as well. That's one way of breaking a kind of circle based on conspiracy thinking, so I think that's really important. But we haven't really got around to thinking about systems of pedagogy and systems of education that are different from the old industrial systems. We're still trained and schooled according to the old industrial logics. And we need to learn how to move beyond that.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael. I think that's all the questions that I have now. It was very interesting, and there's quite a lot of good ideas there that definitely help, like I was saying in the beginning, untangle a lot of this mess. So thank you very much. For everyone watching, do check out the links. We will be linking to Michael's work, and there'll be a lot of lot of stuff to go through, because it's a lot of interesting stuff, like we talked about, but in a lot more detail. So yeah, that's it. Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, nice to talk to you, Alan.